The beginning. In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty, darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Genesis 1. The Hebrew Bible starts off at a point in time when the earth was formless, the earth existing as an empty space or void that was dark and deep and watery or composed of a water-like liquid. We also know that the Spirit of God was hovering over this liquid. And I argue we can equate the formless beginning of earth, this dark, watery abyss at the start of Genesis 1, through the opening lines of Hesiod's Theogony, specifically the first 30 lines or so, along with the Homeric Hymn to Poseidon, right? We can recognize the Greek god Poseidon, as this beginning of form, and the one who acts as this medium between form and deformation, right? To form and deform, which is essentially a flow, right? Just day 1 and day 2 and day 3 of Genesis 1, where form is brought into being, right? Just specifically the solid matter of the earth and the liquid from the ocean. But by the third day of Genesis 1, the earth is completely formed, as in, this solid phase persisting, right? Along with the heavens. And I argue Poseidon represents this coexistence, right? And all the tensions that arise from this meeting of sea and earth, solid and liquid. Like Theogony is probably something akin to the book of Genesis, or if you read all of Hesiod, you would say, yeah, that's kind of like Genesis. And you can say, yeah, this part is like this, and that's like that. But it's really up to one to draw distinctions and interpret meaning, right? And you're the one who has to bring it forth. You have to make a credible argument. So I think by going by the text, we can make more definite claims, right, from this parallel analysis, and we can say so with confidence. Like, I'm going to look at the first 30 lines of the 1,000 total lines of Hesiod's Theogony, and likewise, I'm going to look at the first handful of lines of Genesis out of whatever, there are thousands or so lines in that book. And in particular, Genesis 1 contains 31 lines, and Theogony, the first part, is about 28 to 35 lines, depending on how you want to break it up. And furthermore, we can look at just a smaller select number of lines, say like the Homeric Hymn to Poseidon, which is about 7 lines. And right, so it's just dealing with Poseidon, or this god of the sea, god of the water. Looking at Genesis 1, there's about 13 lines up to the third day, or the formation of land and earth. And you can say take out half of those which apply to the heavens, right, to the sky. We're not going to talk about the air. We're just going to talk about the water and the earth, the solid and the liquid. And if you do that, you have about 7 lines or so, right, from the 13. Within these lines, we can imagine, right, that all the forces that are going to govern the land and sea, or at least this archaic attempt at it, and the interactions they may have with one another, and any combinations are laid out in this fundamental wording or form. So if you go and you read further from Genesis 1, line 6, it says, "And God said, let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water. So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And it was so. God called the vault sky, and there was evening and there was morning, the second day. And God said, let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear. And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and gathered waters he called seas. And God said that it was good." So furthermore, from these selected lines of text, one wants to confirm how similar are they by studying the words that make up the verses. It sounds trivial, but it's what we're going to do. For example, is Genesis 1 talking about Poseidon in regards to the form brought in between the formation of land and sea? Are the texts using the same terms? So we see, for example, dark, deep, watery, earth, heavens, and sea. And they might be different, but earth is Gaia, heavens, it's either you can say it's like sky like Zeus, or you could say it's like Uranus, right? And then sea, well, it's Poseidon, right? We can understand that we might not call them the same thing, but there's an exchange rate, or we can translate between these two. And then reading one will say, yes, okay, all three share commonalities and are, we're going to say they're the same fundamental laws of nature, right, that were observed by these archaic civilizations and conveyed through myth as a common medium. And I'm not saying that they organically everyone came to these realizations, right? Knowledge is a diffusive process, right? It probably starts somewhere and then it spreads to the whole kind of the whole. Well, diffusion is like if you pour a drop of cream into your coffee, right? It's going to spread to the whole coffee, but it's going to start somewhere, right? It's going to diffuse, and it's not like the cream, like the cream just generates from all points in the coffee at once. So Hesiod's Theogony starts off at the Heliconian temple, where the muses dance. The muses dance with soft feet upon the deep blue spring. So the muses are capturing the spirit of Zeus, the chief god. And I'd say it's much like the spirit of God hovering over the waters in day 1 of Genesis 1. And of course, at this point, the earth or the world is formless. And Hesiod's style of poetry is to kind of dance around the words in Greek, right? He uses homophones. He says it's homophones. It's this dual meanings out of similar sounding words. So, for instance, in line 3 of Theogony, the word, well, I'm just going to translate it. It's POSS, right? This Greek word that you can put into the English type POSS is used, which can be foot, husband, or quantity, right? Depending on how, it's just like how we have different kind of similar sounding roots, but they can, depending on how you combine them with other words or conjugate these kind of, some of them could be verbs and stuff. It depends how it depends how you use it in the sentence, right? So for foot, it's POUS, and then quantity is roughly POSOS, right? And ultimately, foot and quantity are one and the same, where foot is a measure of a distance, right? It's roughly a quantity of distance x units from the origin, 0, the origin, the start. So it makes sense that this god of form or position or Poseidon is kind of this movement from the origin, right? This beginning of form that depends on location. Because if you break down the POS further to its root, it's really like PO, right? And from this, you can make words like make or I do or where and whence, respectively. So like PO is where, or depending on who's talking, it could be like a there. It's really a location. Because like if you have apo, it's like, because you have po is kind of where, and then apo is the negation of it, right? You add the a in front of the po, and it's away from. So if you're going away from somewhere, then if you're not going away, you're there, right? You're at that location. So po is like a location, and in general, you could probably just say the p letter, and because like if you go point, right? Like a point is both meaning both the sea, pontos is the sea in Greek, but it's also this single individual in a whole set or group, right? A point is better. It's probably best understood graphically. A point is a number on an axis, and geographically, point is like this single, well, it's just this single like particle of land or area where it meets with the sea or. And the beginnings of navigation depend on position and location, right? The fundamental questions of where are you, and the realization you can go from point A to point B, or walk a distance in feet, and you can change your position on this earth. That everyone is on the earth. That's like the assumption right now, that it's a whole earth, but you can travel across it, right? Through these common root words like po, we can see that. Poseidon, or in general, is the relationship of sea and earth, but he's more like this location, this navigational question, this realization. When you're out on the giant blue ocean, no land in sight, how do you know where you are, right? Especially before any kind of like modern day technology. Even in like the submarine, they used to have to come up to look where they are and stuff like that, and to send out radio signals to position themselves. Because if you're, you can't just go around blind in the ocean or something like that. It's whenever you're going to navigate, you got to have an orientation, right? This kind of origin, and then you got to go a distance, or your understanding of where your position is, always to the origin, right? Because the origin or land or something like that, it's going to give you scale or perspective, and it's going to give you depth too as well. So you have this question: where's your position in regards to some origin, right? That you like again, you understand the Earth as a whole. It's comprised of these 3 fundamental phases, right? This land, earth, and water. And we can inhabit some points or interact with all these 3 phases of matter in some kind of combination. And that's kind of like what the lesser gods start to explain, these kind of lesser forces or stresses. It's like when you watch movies, this theme of being cast away or lost at sea on an island in the middle of the ocean, or these pirates who sail over the seas, and they use these treasure maps, right? It's all like primitive and archaic. They go 12 paces this way, and then like till they get to the palm tree, and then they go 100 paces till they get to the X, and there's a volcano, and then they got to wait for a bird to fly over, and then they can follow the bird or something. It's just like you could imagine these archaic form of locating one's position or destination, right? That's kind of like this Poseidon, this like hymn to Poseidon, or this how we know the themes of the pirate movies, or even just like Genesis 1 to Genesis 3. Furthermore, if you watch the movie Poseidon, it's the most recent one, you see the people that are thrust into these kind of like primitive ways of thinking through these emergency situations, right? They're just thinking about surviving, and like they just use their instinctual knowledge of kind of like directions and an understanding of water, air, and land, how they interact, right? It's like, or I don't know, like a toddler, when they go to preschool, they spend all their day like touching stuff, jumping around, somersaulting, spinning and rolling, and then they go to like swimming lessons, and then they do all that stuff in the water, and they'll go under the water, they'll go up the water, they'll twirl in the water, and they're kind of learning what limitations and kind of what the form of matter is, and how the forces of nature that they're going to spend their life interacting with, how they combine and join, or kind of like, I don't know, combining these chaotic ways too, right? Sometimes it's not always good. It's not always good. And that's kind of what preschool, that's why kids, they get scraped up so much. They're learning what's not and what's good, what's good and what's bad. And then another common theme in the movies like Poseidon is they get, it's this compartmentalizing or separating the phases of matter, right? That's like this Genesis 1 to 3. It's like the rooms, some rooms are like filling with water, and they have to get out of the room because it's filling with water, or they want to seal off a room from water to keep the air in there, or sometimes they want to force water in there to get to a room that doesn't have water and it just has air, and they want to get up out of the ship, right, on this Poseidon movie. And all they have is like these like darkly lit maps and stuff. And then half the time the map doesn't work. They had to like improvise and like float under the water, or drop down and hang glide and stuff. It's like whatever you can scrap up at that time to use with your common sense, or like your experience of what the fundamental forces and phases of matter and nature are, right? Moving on, Hesiod describes the Muses dancing with soft feet above the blue spring, which, again, is like the beginning of the Hebrew Bible with the Spirit of God above the waters of the earth. In addition, we can say that the Homeric Hymn to Poseidon is like the beginning of Hesiod's Theogony, and that both describe the Helicon temple. And basically, again, are the same, where they describe a dark blue spring or water. In the Homeric Hymn to Poseidon, it's translated into English that Poseidon is dark-haired, but in Greek he's described as cyanokaites, right? So like the cyano we can imagine is blue. So we can say they can imagine he has this dark blue hair, right? It's the color of the ocean. The god's hair is like this fabric of the sea, and we can also imagine that this is like the waters, right? The dark waters in the beginning of Genesis 1, this day 1, it's the dark hair of Poseidon. Similarly, in the beginning of Theogony, the spring of water on which the Muses dance or walk with their feet is called violet, or it's, again, a dark blue. And the name for violet is the color of the flower, which is used in the epic Greek poetry to denote purple in the dark ocean. It's Ioades. So this name is like, it's like basically where we get the name iodine. So I'm not saying like Hesiod discovered iodine. I'm saying like the chemist who did discover or isolate iodine named it after this Greek word for violet, which is, well, if you look at iodine, it's kind of very dark, right? It's this dark color. And if blue or purple is dark, it's very hard to just... And iodine is like yellow, right? Once colors kind of get this dark, it's hard to differentiate between one or the other. So I say, yes, it means dark, right? Like in Genesis 1. But more to the point, the root of Ioades is eid, or aid, or ide, which translated into English is idol, or shape, form, and even temple. So combine this with posos, or quantity, we get quantity of form, or shape, or temple. So it's like the beginnings of formation, right? That you're quantifying it, or how much. And I think this is like the big takeaway from day 1 and heading into days 2 and 3 of Genesis 1 is that the earth was formless at first, and it was covered with water, and there was no land, and certainly there was no plants or animals. And eventually, yes, the heavens, sea, and earth are brought into formation, and we understand this kind of like as the earth itself. And Poseidon is the beginning to worship of human-like gods, or Poseidon is the face of kind of this, like, he's somewhat like Odysseus, or he's like Noah, or something we can associate with water gods, right? The Sumerian god Enki, he brings forth form too, because if you read the Sumerian poem Enki and Ninmah, well, it's kind of like the beginning of Theogony, where Enki and these birth goddesses make a new generation of gods, and they form them from the clay. Anyways, Hesiod's Theogony starts with the Heliconian temple, which is in the Boeotian region of ancient Greece, as it was known, but the poem represents in general the region of the Isthmus and surrounding area in the Peloponnesus. So the Arcadian region, right? So the Isthmus, the Peloponnese, and also Attica, but in general this Arcadian region in the Heliconian and the Isthmus of Corinth. So the Homeric hymn to Poseidon starts with I begin to sing, which in Greek is Archaic, or Arco, or like Arcadian, right? If you combine them, this Archaic, or it means before the sing, or you're beginning to sing, right? It's the beginning of song, or you can imagine this song is the beginning of the formation of this new type of poetry, right? So I interpret, Poseidon is this Arcadian god, right? And this is a lot of people have brought forth this claim, and we can say that he's worshipped at the Helicon in this Arcadian region, right? And he's from this archaic era, and he comes into the Iron Age, right? That we understand Poseidon from kind of like this Iron Age conception, right? It's kind of where the gods, we like when Homer talks about the gods, he talks about them in the Bronze Age and the Mycenaean Greeks and all that. But in reality, like, all we know about the gods, or all we know about Greek, is from the classical, or we think as like the beginnings of the early Iron Age, right? That this Hesiod wrote in 700 BC, they say, right? So this is like coming out of this dark age, this archaic age, after the Mycenaean Greeks that we know about from, the Trojan War. So Hesiod describes how muses are dancing and singing the myths of Zeus at his altar. And one of the springs is called Eponos, or Epo, which according to, if you go online, right, so if you read it on the Perseus, it's the Tufts EDU or whatever, use their word study tool, they'll say Epome is like a horse, or it can mean the concept of, or like the idea of a horse. And again, Hesiod, like I said, he likes to dance around the point, so I'll explain, right? So if you read the Homeric hymn to Poseidon, the god is described as the tamer of horses, or Demeter of horses, where Epon, or Epo is horse, but again, like this Epome. So perhaps we can understand Poseidon as a deity associated with the domestication of horses, or maybe he was worshipped as a horse in this primitive, archaic manner. And yeah, if he arises from this water god, or this like watering hole god, this, a god that inhabits a water hole, or just like water source, it wouldn't be surprising to see him be worshipped as a shepherd, or even as an animal at one point. Furthermore, we can interpret Demeter as like it means like measurement, or maybe it's like the taming of the horses, or the metering of it, but maybe it's the process of bringing to form the ideas to shape, or to idolize, or worship more realistic forms, right? Or it could just be that water itself is kind of a taming aspect to horses, right? The one we all know about how they have to drink and they're stubborn about it, but that literally like a horse is kind of useless in the ocean, right? You need to build ships, and Poseidon is kind of the god who kind of like, again, he kind of represents these limitations, or he's the medium, right? And the Helicon and the springs mentioned are real places with real temples of worship, and Peloponnesus. And the Helicon and the springs mentioned are real places, right, with real temples of worship. And the Peloponnesus and Arcadian or Archaic Greece, these are real places and they're real times. And, we could dig up the remains and the places still exist. The temples are real, right? So the spring called Permessus, right, we can translate it to mean something like about the middle. But it also corresponds to a region, right, in Arcadia. And then the Epon spring, the horse's spring, is probably a forerunner to the Pegasus story, where Pegasus, well, he's an actual town in the Isthmus, right? He's in Corinth. If you look, Corinth today, it has the symbol of Pegasus as its seal, and many of these places in Arcadia they're associated with the symbol of a horse, or more so Pegasus. And of course, Poseidon is said to have fathered Pegasus. So maybe the hymn to Poseidon is like this archaic or Arcadian version of this myth, where Pegasus, well, he's talked about later in Hesiod's Theogony and, of course, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. But again, Hesiod dances around the point, saying two things at once, or combining words that individually can have dual meanings, right, and creating homophones and other kind of like veiled truths, right? So it's like poetry. So like Hesiod, he'll say, here, what does he say? And this word first the goddesses said to me, where me is Hesiod. And then the muses tell Hesiod, shepherds of the wilderness, wretched things of shame, mere bellies, we know how to speak many false things as though they were true, but we know when we will to utter true things. And it's kind of like Prometheus, or the serpent in the garden, because if you read the Greek, it's literally says pros mython, right? So it's before the myths, or before the mythos. And again, and then there are also the reference to the belly. It's kind of like Genesis 2 and 3, where the snake in the Garden of Eden is punished by God, and he has to slither around on his belly after. But it really means kind of like deceiving by using homophones, or words that are not true but can be true, right? But in Greek it's better. It's like the muses are they're gonna combine the words. They're gonna join them, right? And then when they join them, they're gonna be similar sounding, right? They're gonna be these homophones. The word homoia, homos, or homeros, and it translates to join, or resembling, or the same. Like a homophone means something similar sounding. So perhaps we should interpret Poseidon as associated with horses and springs, and the Greek word ipome is like resembling a horse, or to have the concept of horses as animals, with 4 legs and a mane and 2 eyes, right? Like, we know exactly what Pegasus looks like, right? He's this white horse flying with wings. He's kind of like an idolatry of this horse-like creature, right? Perhaps like this continuation of Poseidon, or like we understand Poseidon as the god of the sea, but Pegasus is kind of this symbol of him, or somewhat associated with him. From the Homeric Hymn, it says Archaic, or Arcadian, right? Literally beginning of the howl, or Arcadian is that archaic song or howling, that prehistoric chant before the formulaic or formal poetry of Hesiod, the rhyming he talks about in the opening lines, right? The meeting of sounds, the homophones. Because homophone, it means like to join sounds, to bend them like a wheelmaker, or to join them like a carpenter. That Hesiod is going to bring form a shepherd on the Helicon, right? He's instructed by the muses about speaking words of the myths first. He's similar to Prometheus. It's also said that Poseidon has 2 roles, or is given 2 lots: the tamer of horses, right, the Demeter of horses, and the saver of ships. He's the earth mover and the earth shaker. Where earth shaker is probably what phenomenon most associated with God, right? The ability to create waves. He shakes things up. He stirs things up. So perhaps we can imagine his name in a dual manner, as something like Poseidon, right, or Poseidon, right, where Poseidon could be the one who makes the waves, or shakes, or stirs things up, or the Lord of the shake, the Lord of the stir. Where Siwo, or Seismo, is relating to the wave behavior of the sea, right, that we associate with him. Especially in the Odyssey, where Odysseus is washed up on shore, he's carried around like a driftwood, he's like tossed about like a baby seal, and in general, he just sails around the Aegean and Mediterranean, right? He even gets stuck in a cave. It's like all the possible things that can happen to him with respect to the sea, considering like Odysseus is a particle, right? He's going around the sea and he's just getting carried wherever way it takes him. And it's not really kind of like this particle. It exhibits this wave or phase-dependent behavior, right? This psi swell, the shaking or the wave. The Odyssey is not necessarily like Newtonian physics, right? It's not this pure linear conception or proportional conception of displacing x units to the right or left of the origin depending on some kind of stress or something, right? Things are proportional to the stress. Odysseus is twirled, he's swirled, he's brought back in time and place, he's forced to retrace his steps, things aren't fair, he has to go underneath the world itself, time goes back. I mean, it's a completely kind of to me it's like a non-linear understanding of matter with respect to time and space, but there's also kind of like a non-Newtonian movement with respect to like stresses. So the Odyssey is not linear, or at least it's not like not Newtonian. It can't be graphed literally with proportion to the stress or some other phenomenon. There would be kind of these discontinuances in the graph itself, or better yet, one would need to consider other ways to define the space or location first, right? And then you would want to see if it's kind of phase dependent or like water and its waves. You would need to choose another coordinate system, a polar one. And of course there's other geometrical assumptions too to consider. So like the Earth isn't a flat disk, it's spherical. So then you'd say it's like a water ball. It's or like how you can imagine in Genesis 1. It's like or Genesis 1 day 1, just big ball of water. On the other hand, Poseidon's epithet of Earth mover, or literally he's kind of like this kinetic Earth, right? This kinematic understanding of the general motion of objects, right? The pure Newtonian physics of sort, not we're taking count momentum or something. Not that like Hesiod or Homer were Newton, but you can understand how Newton derived a lot of his understanding of physics or nature itself from reading Greek or the Bible, right? Just understanding of water as this form, that one can move land and earth probably in the same way, like a horse, right? The horse is on land is good, but in the same way, a horse is not good on water, but you can operate, you can move the earth on the water. You can move over the earth. And that way we can see that there's a twofold nature of Poseidon, right? That the water does behave somewhat like a particle. Furthermore, water itself is going to take the form of the container it's in. It's always easily form or bend to the shapes, and it's going to meet the interfaces of the solid no matter what. It might take time, but a liquid is always going to flow, right? The water will meet at the position of the solid interface, and it's going to hold the earth to speak, or maybe better yet, it's to say that water is wet, right? And it's going to coat a surface. The waters or the seas will conform or encircle the earth, and not vice versa, which obviously wouldn't make any sense. And like none of this is really profound thing to say. Like everyone knows water is wet, but it is kind of like a fundamental understanding, and it's something that you would like put at the beginning. Like if you're going to write some kind of fundamental literature on physics or something, you would want to put that the water would be it. The understanding of liquid itself as like this different phase would be at the beginning, right? Water is positioned or lies on points along the surface of the earth, thus encircling it or holding its shape. It's like if you have a footprint in the sand, it's going to hold the water, and the water is going to take the shape of that impression of the footprint that's no longer there, right? There's a little bit of memory, or there's a form to the water that it's always going to take the shape of its boundaries, right? In Homer's Odyssey, there's a description of Proetus, who some say is the son of Poseidon. And, well, Proetus, he represents this kind of ever-changing and flowing form and shape of liquids, right? Like Proetus himself lives in the sea, but he also can change into any shape he wants, right? He's a shapeshifter, so... Again, he's the son of Poseidon. Poseidon in general is the laws that govern both kind of the earth and the sea and their interactions and motion and displacement and all that. So where Proetus, again, he's a son or derivative of this overarching fundamental Poseidon. So I'll read from Homer's Odyssey, Book 4. Stranger, replied she, I will make it all quite clear to you. There is an old immortal who lives under the sea. hereabouts and whose name is Proteus. He's an Egyptian. People say he's my father. He is Neptune's headman and knows every inch of ground all over the bottom of the sea. If you can snare him and hold him tight, he will tell you about your voyage, what courses you are to take, and how are you to sail the sea so as to reach your home. And then if you read further, it says, the moment you see that he is asleep, seize him, put forth all your strength, and hold him fast. For he will do this very utmost to get away from you. He will turn himself into every kind of creature that goes upon the earth, and will become also both fire and water. Yeah, so Proteus, again, he's the shape-shifting or the ever-flowing or moving of the water, right? Water can deform and flow, and it behaves as kind of a wave and a particle, right? It's a dual nature of Poseidon. And I'm not saying that water is like light, but but we all agree that the concept of a wave of light comes from the ocean, right? And then people apply this like wave behavior of the ocean to the study of light, right? And likewise, in fields like rheology and polymer science, the movement or ability of materials to deform or flow is phase dependent, where the long polymer chains, they can be unraveled in many ways, but it generally it takes, like, it's a matter of time. Right? Take Play-Doh, for instance, right? Take a ball of Play-Doh and then you have it, grab it with both hands, and then you slowly pull at it, two ends, right? Pull it away with both hands. If you pull it slowly, you'll get a string, right? The Play-Doh will stay connected from one hand to the other. But if you jerk it, if you really pull the Play-Doh apart fast, right, if you don't give it time to relax, the polymer chains to relax, it's going to break apart. So you say if you give it time to unwind, if you pull it apart slowly, it's going to behave like a liquid. It'll flow, it'll deform. But if you pull it, if you jerk it, it's going to behave like a solid, right? It's kind of phase dependent on the behavior, how it flows. It's phase dependent. And that's kind of like, it also depends on time. It's kind of a interesting, it's kind of just an interesting aspect of nature itself. So, and a rheometer or a meter of flow is basically that. Or so you put a material in between two flat discs, right? And then one disc will rotate, or it will shear the material in the middle between the two plates, and it's going to sweep over these angles of shearing, right, or these angles of rotation. And depending on the speed or time it takes to complete the rotation, or how long it takes to spin, the material can behave differently, right? Or it's described as phase dependent, right? That either the material, depending, like the Play-Doh, can behave like a liquid or it can behave like a solid. Furthermore, Hesiod is said to shepherd the goats, which we can equate to the aegis bearer, right? Whereas Aegiokos is the aegis bearing, and aegis bearing is kind of it's used a lot, right? Especially with Athena and stuff, and Zeus. This word to describe the gods, or it's like an object, really. But it's kind of a tricky or elusive word to define. It doesn't really have a definite translation. So, I think I can bring a little bit more clarification. So because it's not like a cat, right? It's not like you know exactly what a cat is or what the color green is. Aegis could come from sheep or goat, or it could be like a goat skin type of shield or herald, or it could mean one who shepherds, or it could mean, well, yeah, it's like the shield of Zeus or a cloak of Athena, they say. It's a goat skin coat, it's a rushing storm or hurricane, and they say it can come from the Proto-European to stir, to set in motion, or it could come from a goat skin shield. It could also mean to move violently, or in Sanskrit, to tremble, to shake. And that's kind of interesting. And Okos is anything that holds, bears, carriage cart, chariot, the wheels of a chariot. So if we transliterate aegis bearer, it's kind of like this symbol of shaking, or the shield that stirs up, or maybe it's like it's like a goat-skinned, the one who has like the goat-skin shield. And the symbol of shaking would make sense, right? That Poseidon causes the waves, or is this cause of this seismic phenomena. Furthermore, we can say maybe that aegis bearing could be like a shear force, right? That if the aegis is shaking, is stirring up, or maybe it's like the shear, or it's like the wool or leather that was sheared off a goat, right? And then later, this is where we get these shear forces, and again, in the study of rheology. In addition, Asia could just be the Aegean or Aegea or Achaia, right? Where Achaia is like the land of the Achaeans, famous from the Iliad. So again, it's a real thing, a location on Arcadia. And the Aegis bearer could be that the Helicon or Acadia in general bears or contains Aegeus or the Aegean or Achaia, or that the land was born from the waves of the Aegean. Perhaps we can say Poseidon is like the depositing or positioning of materials, not necessarily like this total understanding of the physics, like the energy and momentum of particles. It's just this basic understanding of the form of water and earth and how a particle could move, or more importantly, the relationship between land and water, and also like a particle's path or movement within the water with respect to land or like the coast, right, and how they interact. It's possible the Greeks thought the myth of Corinth was formed by Poseidon, right, and it's signified with the temple there himself, that the temple of Poseidon in the isthmus. The temple of Poseidon is the idol. It signifies the partitioning of land and sea, the good, the bad, and the chaotic aspect of it, right? Because the sea is very chaotic. The Helicon is a temple located across the Gulf of Corinth. Again, this twofold nature of Poseidon, right, where temples possibly on both sides of these, both Helicons are on both sides of the Gulf of Corinth. And the one that we do know about, was one of the oldest but most famous of temples, is at the isthmus of Koranth. And the name Helicon itself, well, the Helicon is like, could be translated to the thread spun from the distaff to the spindle. So I don't know if that makes sense if you're like a weaver or something, but I understand it that like from the root, from Helicon, the root is eli, or this li, to roll up. It's like a wave breaking on the shore, right? So that the isthmus itself could be the thread from the spindle that's rolled up, that's connecting Attica and the Peloponnesus, or could just be, again, that Poseidon is kind of like that thread that sits between them, right? He's like the Gulf, the water that sits between the two Helicons, right? Could be that the archaic myth is that the isthmus was made by Poseidon, or the geological forces of the area, be it like an earthquake, a tsunami after the earthquake, a hurricane, or like a volcano, could give the isthmus its form. And Poseidon is kind of like the face or god of that phenomenon, right? He's the one to explain how that might form, right? This kind of like movement of earth and liquid. Poseidon is like the depositing of earth, of land, right? He may be better yet that Poseidon is the early form of geology and oceanography, that Poseidon, or the positing of the earth or movement of the earth by water, created the isthmus of Greece, like how the Egyptians venerated the silt being deposited from flooding rivers in the Nile Delta. Or literally that Poseidon is the earth shaker, and that he's the god of earthquakes and then the tidal waves that kind of follow. And, at the heart of it, the tectonic movement of the plates that create geographic formations at large on the earth. In Homer's Odyssey, he describes how Poseidon turns the Phaeacian ships into stone and cementing it into the sea's floor. Poseidon represents both this flowing liquid, the ocean, taking form of any void, filling in the spaces between land, allowing travel over distances between land, but also it means geological forces that can also turn the sea into land, right? He's the earthquake. He's the one who shakes. He stirs it up. So let's read from Odyssey, Book 8. Tell me also your country, nation, and city, that our ships may shape their purpose accordingly and take you there. For the Phaeacians have no pilots, their vessels have no rudders as those of other nations have, but the ships themselves understand what is that we are thinking about and want. They know all the cities and countries in the whole world and can traverse the sea just as well, even when it's covered with mist and cloud, so that there is no danger of being wrecked or coming into any harm. And then Homer goes on to describe the Phaeacian ships. The ship bounded forward on her way as a four-in-hand chariot flies over the course when the horses feel the whip. Her prow curveted as it were the neck of a stallion. A great wave of dark blue water seethed in her wake. She held steadily on her course, and even a falcon, swiftest of all birds, could not have kept pace with her. And then eventually, he's gonna Neptune or Poseidon's gonna turn this ship of the Phaeacians into the earth. When Earth encircling Neptune heard this, he went to Scheria, where the Phaeacians live, and stayed there till the ship, which was making rapid way, had got close in. Then he went up to it,
turned it into stone, and drove it down with the flat of his hand so as to root it in the ground. After this he went away. And that's the Odyssey, Book 13. And in the Homeric hymn to Poseidon, it said Poseidon is the mover of the earth and fruitless sea, right? He's the god of the deep, who's also the lord of the Helicon and wide Aegean. So he's the one who moves the earth and at the point and spins the thread or rolls up the thread and creates the broad-bearing Aegis or the Aegis, or he governs between them two. So either way you look at it, the sea and earth are two different states of matter, and they meet at the seashore in a variety of formations that can be characterized, right? We know as geography, or in particular, also kind of like geology, right? And the underlying mechanisms can be understood as well. And these formations, patterns, and behavior can be described through the god Poseidon, right? To posit something concrete or have one foot on solid ground, the beginning of form, the beginning of the temple or idea of idolatry, just qualifying or quantifying the form. It makes sense. The poem of Poseidon describes the area surrounding this myth of Corinth, right, that connects both Attica and the Peloponnesus, but also separates the Aegean and Gulf of Corinth, or separates the water. It's an obvious geographic feature that can be exploited for power or money just through trade alone, right? And we know this as a fact, right? Because in the archaic period of Arcata, they built the highway of some sort and attempted also to build a canal through the isthmus, right? So you can land your ship on one side of the isthmus and then possibly carry it on this highway, or put it on maybe like on a horse or something, and then go to the other side of the isthmus. And you can see how this can be a profitable place, a location, right? This isthmus, and geographic features like straits and isthmus have always been parts of mythology, right? With Heracles holding up the pillars at the Straits of Gibraltar, Orion considered to be the maker of the Straits of Sicily, and then we know from Hebrew myths Moses parts the Red Sea. Whereas Poseidon, maybe he's the solid depositing into the form of an isthmus, or therefore he's similar but opposite maybe of Orion, where Orion is the god of straits, where Poseidon could be considered maybe the god of the isthmus, or the medium of sea and earth, and the movement of that space occupying both, right? The ocean or seashore, ocean bottom. Poseidon, the carrier or bearer of earth, right? It's what he's called. He's called the earth carrier, the Gaia Okos. And the ending of the Homeric hymn to Poseidon is very interesting. So it says, Ekon pluisin arge. And the ending of the Homeric hymn to Poseidon is interesting. It says, Ekon pluisin arge. And this means roughly to bring sailors on ruin, but it can mean to bring, sail, or float and flow, right? So basically all the things that Poseidon can do. He can bring you, he can bear something, he can float on it, or he can flow. Pluisin, or in general plu, is to float, or perhaps we can think of float as kind of like ply, right? If you take the root of plu or pl, it's like ply, or this infinitely small layer or laminar layer that essentially floats on the surface of the earth, right? Or that the boat or a sailboat or something is going to float on this layer of the top surface of the water, and it could share similarities, right, to Pelasgian, right? There's plusin, or plu, where plu is to sail, but Pelasgian is more like a wander, but maybe they're both kind of come from the same root. There's pl, right? And maybe the Pelasgians were the forerunners to the Dorians, and they were the ones who got here in this before the Archaic and early Iron Age of Greece, and that the Arcadians, maybe they are like descendants of the Pelasgians, or maybe that they come after the Pelasgians, these first ones who come to sail there, right? The Pelasgians were known as these sailors or sea people or wanderers, right? And perhaps the Arcadians are related to them, and it's through this word sail. But nonetheless, combining the root PL and then the RH or RHG from Argego, you get many of the words used in the Odyssey, right? If you just use PL and RH, right? There's float and flow, where Arego we can imagine as or as like an unrego, right? It's a rego. It's this negating of rego, where rego is to ruin, or so you could say arego is to unruin, or it could be understood as also as orego, to stretch to the arm forth, to reach out. And all in all, both forms have this RHG as a root, right? Where reo it means to flow, as in like rheology is the study of flow or deformation. And this all makes sense where, again, rheo, the ability to deform or flow, and it's related to this stretching or stress or put a force on the matter or liquid, it's going to deform and it's going to allow it to flow, right? And this is how we kind of understand it today with rheology. And it seems the ancients understood physics, or maybe better yet, they were able to give this kind of qualitative account of phenomena and some of the underlying basic mechanisms without getting into the heavy-duty quantification of the actual forces at play, right? So, again, rheology is the ability of a material to flow or deform, and it undergoes a shear stress. And the shear can be understood as a force, like a boat would feel as it glides through the water. Or it's like, I don't know, when you pass like a wooden spoon through like soup or something, right? You're shearing the liquid. You're passing it through. The sides, like the walls, are rubbing up against the particles of the liquid. And whether or not the liquid touches the wall or not, the shear stress is going to affect a deformation in the liquid as a whole, right? And it's going to cause it to flow, and it's going to have some geometry. The flow is going to have some geometry, right? And if it's basically a Newtonian response to the shear, the velocity profile is going to be the same as the strain rate. And I don't know. And this doesn't necessarily have to make sense, but liquids can behave in a non-Newtonian way, where like toothpaste, if you just squirted toothpaste out onto your palm of your hand, you could turn your palm over and it's not going to flow, right? Like toothpaste, you have to push it out of a tube. You have to apply pressure. Or ketchup, you have to hit it. You have to shake it up in order to get that liquid to flow. It's a non-Newtonian liquid where you just can't rely on the gravity to get the stress, right? Where, again, the Newtonian fluid is proportional to the stress, whereas like something that's non-Newtonian, it's something else. You have to add more force to it, or it behaves in a different way that's not proportional in a linear way. And then some materials are more viscous or have the ability to resist deformation, right? Viscosity is the ability to resist flow or resist deformation. And these behave obviously different than ones that are more or less viscous or flow less or more readily. So honey and water have different viscosities, right? And they have different behaviors and they flow differently. And rheology and the behavior of the ocean are kind of complicated matters, right? Like this, I've kind of tried to simplify it somewhat, but there's a lot of chaotic forces and they result in crazy behavior, right? We see like whirlpools, eddies, the rolling and swirling of the waves and the stirring motions, and then like the earth or the ocean itself can pull you out, and they have these riptides and all that, and all that stuff is not really well understood, right? It's kind of very chaotic. It could assume many different shapes, and there's a lot of different forces and geometries that can come into effect just on the kind of flowing nature of the ocean itself, right, or liquid. And then the liquid itself, depending on the material, it can cause thinning or thickening, right? So the shear, going back to the shear. So you could, like for paints for the house, that's shear thinning. So like a paint, if you have old paint, you have to stir it up, right? You have to get it. You have to stir it before you use it, or else it's not going to be as well. It's not going to coat the wall as well, right? You have to. It's shear thinning. You have to stir it up or shake it up before you use it. Cement's kind of the same thing, right? You have to constantly be stirring cement. It's shear thinning. The stirring of the cement causes it to flow or to become more viscous. And if you didn't shear it as much, it would become thicker, right? But there's some materials behave completely different, right? They're called shear thickening, like egg whites or cream, right? If you stir or you fold the egg whites or the cream for a period of time, they're going to become thicker, right? And it's because of the shearing. And these seem like, they're not necessarily like the most exciting things, but they're pretty fundamental, right? And you can see how kind of industries or other kind of, you could build on these kind of sciences, that these are kind of fundamental understandings of nature, and that the ancients understood the forces and the phases of nature very well. And just the fact that so much of the scientific field is named after Greek words is a testament to that, right? Like I don't have to go out and invent new words. Like they're in Hesiod, they're in Homer, like rheology, right? Rhea is the wife of Kronos. Maybe they didn't have to have like all the quantification of all the different energy levels of electron spin and all that kind of nerdy stuff. but they laid the groundwork to begin to treat these complex behaviors like the ocean and observe this in a scientific way, right? And it begins the mathematical approach and the mathematical way of solving these different, like equations, basically. Poseidon is the beginning to qualitatively describe these phenomena and give definitions to form and its ability to undergo change, i.e., flow with respect to time and space, right? And that Poseidon moves Earth or displacing in space, but also he is the son of Kronos, subject or derivative of time, right? It's phase dependence. And through these definitions and laws of nature, we can begin to formulate theories on how nature itself works, and that can be described through mathematical equations and backed up by observable scientific data.